Job chapter 38. You're not all that. You know, we've gone through, obviously we know the story by now of Job, the story of how everything seemed to go wrong for Job, all within a course of a day. And then, of course, he begins to mourn the circumstances and cope with them and figure out how to make his way through a very difficult situation, probably the most difficult situation that we could envision. Then his three friends come along, and they give Job lots of advice, and lots of advice that sounds maybe good on the surface even. However, we've kind of unpacked some of that and realized it's not all that it was cracked up to be either. And we kind of skipped over the last couple of chapters. The fourth friend arrives here at the kind of the last hour that we kind of skipped over him. His name was Elihu, and he takes about three chapters or so to give his 2 cents worth, even though he says, I'm not as aged or as wise as the other three friends, but we find out that his counsel is really not any better either. And so we kind of, throughout the book of Job, we've gotten 37 chapters in, and we still don't really have answers to Job's problems. We don't really seem to be able to make any sense out of Job's circumstances. And, oftentimes I just think this is characteristic of our own lives as well, isn't it? How oftentimes do we get into difficult times and difficult circumstances, and we feel like, I've gone through 37 chapters of my life and still haven't figured this out yet. And that I think there's probably some parallels there that we're meant to draw. But here we see in chapter 38, after all of this counsel has been gotten, and Job is still in the midst of really a feeling of anxiety, if you will, over the fact that not just he has the same problems, but he's gotten this advice, but his circumstances are still where they are. He's still not made sense of them. I'm sure that there was a lot of anxiety in Job's mind, and here he was, at the beginning of chapter 38, finally we see the first 3 words, then the Lord answered. Finally we get to hear what God has to say. It says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And so we're gonna take a look at what God had to say to really, as much to Job's counselors as he did to Job at this point in time, but he's really speaking to them as a group here. I titled the message this morning, You're Not All That, because, back in I guess maybe the late 80s or the early 90s, kind of a popular phrase that used to be thrown around, if somebody was really, they had it all together, they had, all of the great friends and relationships. If they had the money, if they had the car, if they had the whatever it was, they said, I'm all that, right? They had to say it with some swagger. I don't know how I never really got it down, but, that's what they would say. I'm all that, right? And then, as if that person was not going to be outdone, the guy who's next to them who felt like they really could one-up them, they would say, I'm all that and a bag of chips. Okay, anybody remember that? I'm all that and a bag of chips. So that was, you can't one-up me on that one, right? And so that phrase kind of came along, and it kind of oftentimes, I think is still used today sometimes. Maybe not the bag of chips stuff. That kind of dates me, I guess. But but the fact is, we still have this desire in our culture for people to portray, I've got it all together. I've got everything I need. And you know what? It's this sense of, if I could just have everything figured out in my life, if really I had all the friends and all the money and all the relationships that I really think would make me happy, I would be all that. And what we're going to find out from the passage today is we're really not all that, and that's really not in the end all that we need. And that's really what Job is going to be finding out from God himself. See, Job's friends were there. They felt like they were all that. They had come. They were his good friends. They had spent time. They had spent money with Job. They had tried to comfort him and give him counsel. And then this Elihu had come, and he had given his counsel. Job had given his best defense. He said, "Hey, my conscience is clean. I've got nothing on me that I feel like God has to pin me with. No reason for this." And all of these chapters have been taken up, and none of it had changed Job's condition in the littlest of ways. The fact is, sometimes when you think that you're all that, you'll find it doesn't seem to make the difference that you hoped it would make. And that's really the situation that we're in. And the first thing that we see a couple of different points from the Lord as we look through this. And the first we see in verses 1 through 3, God says, you're not all that because you don't know what you don't know. That's what starts with in verses 1 to 3. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? I think, first of all, I think it's interesting, here the Lord out of the whirlwind is how he announces himself to Job. Elijah got to hear God's voice from the still small voice, right? He wasn't in the whirlwind. Other times, however, like with Job, God decided, I'm going to come with power and authority. I'm going to show my awesomeness. I'm going to demonstrate this. This is how God comes to Job this time. It was by design. You see, the counselors, they thought they had it all together. They needed to see God's great display of power. Who gets to speak out of a whirlwind? Only God. Only God gets to give his counsel that way. That is a great contrast over the limited knowledge and power that these counselors had. But then God says, the first words out of his mouth is this, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? You think about this, this is a scathing rebuke right off the bat. Who are these people who think they're giving you good advice, Job? What do they think they're talking about? They're darkening their counsel because they've got lots of words, but they don't have the knowledge behind it. Counsel is supposed to shed light on our circumstances, right? If you say, I don't know which way to go, I need help, I need wisdom, I need direction, what do? My path is dark. Well, maybe I need to get some counsel. And of course, that's biblical. That's right. We should be getting counsel. And the idea behind the counsel is, hey, okay, now I understand. Now I didn't understand before, but now I'm enlightened, right? And what does God say? All they've done is shed more darkness on your path than shed light. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words? In Job's case, they were making Job's circumstances even more murky. They made him basically end with more questions than he had answers. They had given plenty of words to Job, as we just mentioned, but they didn't have really the intimate knowledge of why Job was in the situation he was in. Because we know, of course, with Job, who was the only one that knew? God himself. And so I think this is maybe just a side note, but the fact is this. Counsel is important and counsel is good. But sometimes if you're the one who's asked for counsel and you don't know the answer, instead of filling up words without knowledge, sometimes it's better just to say, I don't know. I don't have the answer. Sometimes we don't have to have all the answers. I think that's some of the hardest things for us to say to people sometimes, isn't it? I just don't know. Maybe I can find out for you. Maybe there's some answers that I can get from God's word, but right now, I don't know the answer. Instead of just saying, I've got more to say. Some people have a whole lot to say and not a lot of knowledge behind it. And so God continues in verse 3. He says, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and you answer thou me. So his command now to Job and to his counselors, he says, all right, fasten your seatbelts. That's essentially that's the paraphrase. Fasten your seatbelt, Job. Things are going to get fast and furious here real quick. You get prepared to hear from the Lord. Gird up your loins like a man. You don't want to take this sitting down. You're going to have to stand up, and you're going to have to be prepared for some of the things that I'm about to unveil to you. Questions that you can't answer, things you haven't even considered yet. God is about to give Job and his friends this little pop quiz. Quiz that they weren't expecting. And he's about to show them that they don't really know what they don't know. Sometimes it's okay to say, I don't know, but I know where to find it. But if you don't even know the questions to ask, You don't even know. It's like somebody who says, I don't know how to spell a word, and it used to be, well, go look that up in the dictionary. Well, how do I look it up in the dictionary if I don't know how to spell it? That's kind of the idea behind this. We don't often know the answers, and we don't even know how to look them up because we don't even know what we don't know. Our knowledge is that limited. God has all of those answers. He's got all the power. He's got all the authority. And so instead of shedding light by our own counsel, sometimes we need to recognize that we don't know what we don't know. Let's look at verses 4 to 6. He says, secondly, God says, not only do you not know what you don't know, he says, you haven't been there or done that. You haven't been there or done that. Let's look at verse 6. He says, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. What's God saying? He says, Job, I don't remember seeing you there when I was laying the building blocks of the universe. Maybe you were standing off in the corner somewhere, but I don't remember you being there. He says, if you know so much, why don't you tell me how I did it? He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Of course, these whole series of questions are all rhetorical questions, right? We all know that the answer is, I don't have an answer to that one. And God keeps laying them on. The whole chapter is full of these. And we don't have time to go through every one, but that's what he's saying. You weren't there at the beginning. He says in verse 5, who laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who has stretched the line upon it? If you've ever done masonry, they have this line, right? To maybe keep all the blocks even. They stretch it across there and make sure that none are up or none are down or in or out or anything like that. He says, well, when I was building the universe and I was putting the world together and laying the blocks, he says, were you there holding the line? Were you there making sure that all the blocks were in set the right way? That's the imagery that God's giving us here. Who laid the measures thereof? Who stretched the line upon it? Were you there to make sure everything was plumb, Job? Were you this job foreman at the time or what? No. He says, you weren't in any of this. Verse 6, he says, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Who laid the cornerstone thereof? He says, by the way, what did we put? What was the footer? He's thinking construction terms. When I built the universe and I hung the planets all out here in space, what did I hang them on? What did we use as the footer underneath this foundation? Where are the foundations fastened? Who laid the cornerstone? Of course, in building and masonry again, the cornerstone is what made the whole, had to be perfect, right? So that everything else was based off of the dimensions and the plumb of the cornerstone. He says basically to them, how are these planets hung in space? How did I anchor them down? What kind of cornerstone did I use? How did I make sure everything is just plumbed up the way it is perfect? He says, you haven't been there and you haven't done that. Job, you've got a lot of questions. You got a lot of counselors here, but none of them were here at the beginning. None of them really have the experience that's needed to answer the questions that you've got. Let's look down in verse 17. We looked at those this morning. The next little section of verses we're going to take a look at this morning. He says in verse 17, have the gates of death been opened unto thee, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? So he says, let's talk about the fundamentals. He says, okay, if you say, you don't know what you don't know, and you haven't been there or done that, he says, really, that comes down to these verses, you really can't even figure out the fundamentals. You don't even know the basics. He says, here are some of the most basic questions of life that we all face. Thousands of years later, they're the same questions, by the way. Have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Hast thou seen the shadow of death? Do you understand what happens at death? Do we understand death? We understand death happens. But do you really understand how that works? Medicine doesn't understand it. Doctors don't really understand it. We know that the heart stops and the brain quits doing its, brain waves or whatever it is. You stop breathing. There's things that we know that stop. Those are physical things. But do you really understand how a body and a soul who are merged together, in some way the body dies and the soul, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? We take that as a fundamental truth. Do we understand how it works? No. I never read that in a science book. I never understood that. This is what God's saying here. Have you understand how the gates of death, do you understand the doors of the shadow of death? Do you understand how these things happen? No. This is a fundamental thing that's happened to every human being since the beginning of time. We don't get it. We don't understand. Verse 18, he says, hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare us if thou knowest it all. He says, do you have a measurement of everything in the earth? Do we have a measurement of the earth? Now, of course, today, we know the earth is about 25,000 miles around the equator. And we've got satellites, and we've got exact measurements of things. But do you know what? My GPS still takes me down dead-end roads. You know, if we had it all figured out, all the map makers would be out of business. Google could pull all of those little special mapping cars that they send out around the country. They just park them over in the salvage yard because we'd have it all figured out. We may think we know a lot about the breadth of the earth, but the bottom line is this: we don't really know the details. We don't really know it. Verse 19 and 20. He says, where is the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, that thou shouldest know the paths to the house thereof. Here's another fundamental. You understand about light and darkness? Well, sure we do. Turn the lights off, it's dark. Turn the lights on, it's light. We understand all that. You need light to grow things, you know. We go to bed when it's dark. We all got it down, but you know what? We still don't understand dark and light. The physicists have come up with this idea of, well, light is a particle. It's also a wave, and it functions in different ways, and it vibrates at different frequencies. And we've tried to explain it, but the fact is, we still don't really understand the fundamental nature of light and darkness. This is a thing that every human being has always touched. We don't understand it. Where does it come from? Have you ever tried to store light? Ever gone to Walmart and says, I'd like to buy a bottle of light today? Pour a little of that out. We can't store it. How about darkness? I'd just like a bottle of darkness today. No, we can't. We didn't. We don't have it. We have no way to store it. It's either there or it's not. Ultimately, we can produce light with a flashlight and things. But we don't really have it. That's what he's saying. Can you take the bound thereof? Do you know the paths to the house thereof? There's no such thing. There's no house where they're stored. Verse 21, he says, knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great? He says, do you know it because you're old enough, or you've learned enough, or you've gone to school enough? You've gotten enough wisdom, Job? No. Tells his counselors, ultimately, many lifetimes of learning and knowledge is not going to give you even the basic fundamentals of what life's about. Because we don't know it. We don't even know the basics. Even with our modern technology, we still don't have it figured out. Life and death, darkness and light, we still find ourselves empty. Let's look down at verse 31. He continues, verse 31, he says this, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loosen the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season? Canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? Of course, these are all references to things in space, stars and constellations and things like that. And ultimately, God is saying with this group of verses, he says, you couldn't change things if you tried. You couldn't change things if you tried, if you wanted to. He gives you some specific instances, by the way, of constellations and stars that we even know today. Pleiades versus Orion. You see this, if you're not an astronomer, you may not have caught all of these references. But by the way, this is just, I sometimes get to say this every now and then. We tend to think that people who lived thousands of years ago were like cavemen, right? They kind of say, star, in the sky, That's what our history books would like to talk about. These guys knew astronomy. These guys knew constellations. They looked up and they knew Orion. They knew Pleiades. I don't even know Pleiades. You know, there's stuff that they knew that we don't even teach our kids in elementary school today. The fact is, these guys were educated. These guys knew what was going on, and so God could speak to them in these terms, and when we read it thousands of years later, we have to go do the research. What's he talking about? Pleiades and Orion, what does that mean? I missed that chapter. That's the truth. Well, anyway, the Institute for Creation Research helped me out with some of this, because they do these types of sciencey things. And they said, look at this difference. He says, can thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? This idea here, Pleiades is a cluster of stars known as the Seven Sisters. And you could look it up and find them sometime at night. They were anciently known as the Seven Sisters. And they are bound together, we know today, based on our research, we know today that these 7 stars are bound together with a gravitational force. There's 7 stars that are all bound together gravitationally. Okay, they're kept in sync with each other through some type of gravitational force. However, we also have a constellation known as Orion. You know, Orion's belt, you might have heard of that. Well, it's another group of stars. Again, it's a group of stars, but those are not bound together gravitationally. They're there. We see them as a group of stars, but they don't have this same type of gravitational force between them. Interestingly enough, what does he say? Can you take the 7 stars of Pleiades and create the gravitational force that keeps them together? He says, or can you take Orion and the constellation there and make them, go away? Can you loose those? He says, no, you can't do that. Those stars are still in the same spot today as they were in Job's day. It's because God's decided that's how they're going to work. We didn't have anything to say about them. He says, canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season? Mazzaroth is a difficult word to translate, but it really comes down to the idea of the various astrological signs that we tend to have turned into today, but they were the signs of the zodiac. They were the constellations, the various constellations that come and go throughout the year. Of course, you have, I can't even name them all. Cancer, you have, Pisces and all these other types of constellations. Throughout the year, they appear through the sky, right? Well, they knew about those back in the day. He says, can you bring forth those signs, then make those constellations change throughout the course of the year? Job? Nope, can't do that. How about Arcturus? Arcturus is another maybe obscure one for us. It's known today as Ursa Major, or the Great Bear. You'll go out and look in the sky, you'll see the Great Bear. The Great Bear, and the stars that are in the tail of the bear are considered his sons. And so the stars in the tail of the bear are constantly in motion. They're constantly moving, and they gravitate nearly around the North Star. What does he say? Can you guide Arcturus with his sons? Are you controlling where those bear stars are going around the North Star that are constantly moving? He says, no, you're not doing that. He says, do you know the ordinances of heaven? Can you set the dominion thereof in the earth? He says, do you understand the rules and the laws and the physics of space and the universe, how it all works? He says, do you get to set the boundaries of the universe, set the dominion? Do you get to call the shots? Well, no, that's good, because we know that by Jesus Christ, all things consist. That's what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us he is holding the universe together. It's a good thing that he didn't put that in our hands. We'd have really made a mess of it by now. This is what God's saying to Job. He says in verse 34, let's bring it down to earth. Let's bring it a little closer. Okay, you're not a universe guy. Let's just bring it in here, a little closer to us. Canst thou lift up the voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? Canst thou send lightnings that they may go and say unto thee, here we are? He says, just forget about space. Let's just look at the clouds. Can you bring the rain in when you need it? No. He says, can you direct the lightning down where you want? Well, some of us wish we had that power. We have a few people we might like to zap. He says, but no, you can't do that. You can't bring the rain down, and you can't direct the lightning. You've got no ability. You couldn't change things if you tried. That's what God's saying to Job. You have not the power or the authority. And he comes down to this ultimate rhetorical question, which should be very obvious where he's going with this. The argument concludes ultimately with verse 36. Verse 36 says this, "Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? Or who hath given understanding to the heart?" This implies a couple of things. That wisdom and understanding are things that are given to us. It's not things that we can attain on our own. It's things that must be granted to us or gifted to us in some way. And it also means that we have to look to someone else, someone bigger than us, for that wisdom. God is saying, have I made my point? Have I made my point, Job? Job's friends? You understand how little you really know? How little you're actually able to change? How you may think that you've been there and done that. You may think that you've got it all figured out, but you don't. And we might think, man, this seems like a harsh chapter. What are we supposed to get out of this? This seems like a difficult one for us. And you might think, man, Job's and his friends are just getting beat up. If somebody came to you and says, I want to tell you all the things you don't know. You don't know this and you don't know that, and you can't change anything about it. We might think he was being cruel or being, hostile in some way. But I really don't think God was trying to show Job and his friends these things to try to put them down or to put them in their place. I don't think God was trying to make them feel like failures. Were Job and his friends probably some of the smartest guys that were there? Probably. Probably some of the smartest guys on the planet at the time. God wasn't there just because he wanted to make them feel like failures. He wanted them to understand that in some circumstances, some situations, when things are bigger than you can understand and explain, you may have stepped outside of your area of expertise. We all have little areas where we kind of know, some things. We kind of tend to know more than other people about certain things. And whether it's maybe you went to school for something, or maybe you've just got a lot of experience with it, or, whatever it is, everybody has their own little area that we kind of, hey, this is my little fiefdom. I'm gonna be the keeper of this knowledge. I'm gonna be the one who understands and kind of dispenses this to other people. And that's all well and good, and it's right, and it's helpful, because where would we be if we didn't have experts we could go talk to? That's what Google specializes in, right? You just Google it, and everybody there's an expert, so you can get on there and tell everybody what the answers are. No, the fact is we need experts, but the fact is when you get out of your area of expertise, you can get in trouble real quick, can't you? It's when we come to believe because I know this, that means I know all of this. That's when the problems begin to happen. I've always told people I'm not medical. People say, well, I tend to see a lot of people in hospitals. I see a lot of people with like all kinds of whatever things, surgeries and operations and sicknesses and this and that, because as a pastor you tend to be in the hospital a lot or visit people who need these visits that are sick and healing, and they tell me I have this or this. I've heard all kinds of medical things, but you know what? I'm not medical. I understand it, I comprehend it, but in the end of the day, I'm not writing your prescriptions. And that's a good thing. You don't want me there. I don't even like blood that much. I really don't want to see open wounds and all the rest. I really, I didn't go in the medical field for a reason. It's not where I want to be. But I seem to, you get along with it enough. I could come along and talk to somebody. Oh yeah, well I know so-and-so had this, and this is what they were prescribed, and their healing is this. Yeah, I probably know some of those answers, but should I be dispensing that advice? No, I should not be. I should be careful. That's not my area of expertise. This is what God is saying to Job and his friends. He says, you know what? There are some parts of life, some realms that are beyond our comprehension, some things that we just aren't going to be able to wrap our head around. And we need to recognize that's not my area of expertise. It's where I need the Lord. Instead of having anxiety over your circumstances, you need to learn something else. A simple trust in a sovereign God. That's a hard thing to learn. When you think that you're all that, when you think I've got it all together, when you think I can figure this one out, when you think if I just do this and do that and get the counsel and whatever it is, I can make it all happen. You know what? That only works to a point until you realize you can't. And then what happens? Anxiety sets in. I've exhausted all of my resources. I've looked at all of the textbooks. I've asked all my friends and counselors what can be the problem in my circumstances. I've Googled the answer. And in the end, I've come up short. I've come up empty. I don't have the answers that I need. And do you know what I find? I just need to trust in God. I need a simple trust in a sovereign God. I need to recognize my anxiety will only get higher when I continue to try to deal with circumstances that are beyond my control with my own limited knowledge. And so we're going to just close with this, Matthew chapter 6, because this is exactly what Jesus was telling us in his discourse here, that instead of the poetic language of Job, Jesus brings it right down to earth, as he always does in his teaching. And in Matthew chapter 6, he talks about this very problem, the anxiety that we have sometimes over our circumstances. And in Matthew 6:25, Jesus says this, "Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? For after all these things do the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God, and his righteousness, and all of these things shall be added unto you. Therefore take no thought for the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Do you hear a picture of Job 38 and what Jesus is saying? It's a picture of what it is that really we need to have. The simple trust in a sovereign God. When we can let go of the idea that I need to figure it all out. When we can begin to let go of the fact that I've got to worry about what's coming down the pike. When we have no control over that. We don't have any control over tomorrow. And the fact is, we don't have control over today. We have to recognize every day, every moment is a moment that's given to us as a gift by God. It's a moment that we need to trust him for the needs that we have. It's not saying that we just go through life haphazardly or lackadaisically without planning and without preparation. That's not the idea behind this. The idea is we should be able to go through life without the anxiety. of trying to solve our own problems. The anxiety of trying to figure out big issues with a very small and limited knowledge and experience that we have. We are designed to have a simple trust in a sovereign God. And you know, when you have a high regard for your own ability and your own wisdom or your own experience, you're going to find that you also find that you have a high level of anxiety when circumstances are out of your control. But when you have a high regard for God's greatness, for God's wisdom, for God's control, and God's love for you, what ultimately results? You will have a high level of trust in Him, no matter what circumstances you may face in life. There's no circumstances beyond His control. There's plenty of them beyond our control. But nothing is greater than our God. So we have to remember sometimes we're not all that.